Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros.
Good morning. This is Ceasefire, brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And today we are going to talk a little bit about understanding the Constitution and a survey that is done annually about people's understanding of the Constitution. Could you tell us about that survey?
Absolutely. So there is a survey that's been done every year since 2014. They do it earlier in the year, and they release the results on Constitution Day. And it's from the Annenberg Constitution Day Civics Group. And it has some interesting information in it because they basically go out and do the survey and they're trying to find out what Americans know about their Constitution and their rights in the Constitution.
But you put them on the spot then.
Yeah.
Oh, that's scary.
It is scary. And honestly, I don't know how I'd do if I was approached on a man-on-the-street interview and I had to answer some questions. I'd like to think that I'd do well, and so maybe these people are struggling, but the results are startling, not very good. And tell you right now, the highlight was that when people were asked what specific rights are guaranteed by the First Amendment, nearly 3/4 of respondents named freedom of speech. The other 4 rights are recalled by far fewer people. The second most often cited, freedom of religion, is named by just 39% of respondents.
Yeah. I saw that and I was like, oh, that's sad. But at the same time, if you look through those rights and you ask people, is this a right protected by the Constitution? I think most people would say yes, like freedom of the press. People say, yeah, that's protected by They may not know which amendment it is. But I think it's buried in our culture so much that people do understand that they exist.
So you're saying it's almost like a multiple choice test. When the answer's in front of you, you can pick it out of the 4 options. If you just had to think of it without a little clue in front of you, you're probably going to grasp at straws trying to come up with something.
That's what I think. And I think a lot of these sort of man-on-the-street kind of survey things have some of that, because a lot of people's understanding is there in the background, but they may not know the details or the number or the date or something like that. And I'm not trying to protect everybody that doesn't know anything about the Constitution, but I do feel people sort of have a deep gut feeling about what's there.
It's ingrained in the spirit of being an American.
Right. Yeah. So if you go to Germany or the UK and you say, do you have freedom of the press? And they'll say, I don't know, what's that? The government lets us do stuff.
Right.
In America, you're like, yeah, the press is allowed to look into anything they want, and it's just part of our culture.
Yeah. Freedom of the press being one of those. It's in the First Amendment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's dive into some of these. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and this is about the branches of government. Nearly 2/3 of Americans can name all 3 branches of government. 13% can name 2 branches, and 8% can name only 1, and 15% cannot name any at all. If you take those last 2 quarters, the 8% that can only name 1 and the 15% that can't name any at all, that's 23%, nearly a quarter of the population is incapable of naming more than 1.
Yeah. And one thing I always try and tell myself when I see these surveys is 20% of the population will always decide on anything. You ask how many people believe in UFOs, 20%. How many people believe in gnomes running around cutting our power cords under the ground? 20%. So I always give that 20% out as just people that, I don't know whether they are just having fun or what, but I throw out 20% on either side of any kind of question. But that's still high. You would think people would know it. A lot of people don't know, don't pay attention. They don't pay attention to their government. And also, we're also talking about there's probably immigrants in there that may not have learned stuff. There's younger people. I don't know. And that sort of gets to the survey size.
Survey size was surprisingly low. I was shocked when I saw this number. It was 1,600 people.
Yeah.
That's not a big sample, and we're talking over 300 million Americans. I would have liked to have seen a bigger number.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I didn't see in here, and I'm always looking for stuff like this when I read these studies, like you pointed out, were these people new to the United States or were they illegals? What was the average age of those people?
Yeah.
There's a lot of information we don't know. Are these people who regularly vote? Because I'd like to think, when you look at the number of voters that are out there, it's a small number compared to the rest of the population. But voters tend to be more engaged than people who do not vote. This survey doesn't tell you if these people are voters or not. And you read that and you might be alarmed, like, oh, my God, these people are voting. They may not be. We don't know.
Yeah. Would actually be a good marker, because if they're a voter, that means, okay, they're a little bit older because they're not kids. They're people that have lived in America for a while. And so you could expect them to know some of this stuff. Yeah.
Right.
So that would be nice to know, is the profile of the people as to what their background is, whether they would be expected to know this or not.
But I thought anyway, when I was reading this, it's like, despite my reservations about the small sample that they had, that it was an interesting topic, because it's really what we talk about when we do this show, is we're talking about civics and civility and civic engagement. And I would bet that if we had a larger sample, we'd still see a surprising number of people that don't have the basic knowledge. I think you're correct when you say that they have that sort of ingrained understanding of it, but put on the spot and asked to talk about the Seventh Amendment, they might have difficulty doing that. And that reminds me, when we had our foreign exchange student from France with us last year, she took an American government course, and oh my gosh, every day she'd come home and I need to learn the Bill of Rights. And she learned beyond that. She's asking me about the 22nd Amendment. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't remember that. What is that one? And she got really good at it. She's a smart person, but she was reading it every day. Yeah. We fall out of practice. And it's a lot like riding a bicycle. If you haven't been on a bike in a while and you get back on, you wobble a little bit until you remember things. And I think that's why it's important for us to talk about our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, so that we can not only remember, but put into practice those things that we might have forgotten. Exercise those rights, as they say.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Something that did just pop into my head, though, is there's a question we should ask ourselves. Is it more important to know that freedom of the press is in the First Amendment, protected by the Constitution, or is it better that the people of America have it ingrained in their culture that the press is free?
The latter.
Right. So it's nice to have the details and have people know the knowledge, but it's even better if you can have the culture actually embody that concept. And I think for the most part, and this gives me a lot of optimism about America, is the rights in the Bill of Rights are embodied in our culture. And you know that when you go to other countries and that it's not there.
Right.
And you go there and like, wow, what do you mean that the government can billet the soldiers in your house whenever they want? That's just unbelievable.
Yep.
But other countries don't have this type of protection that we do.
That one that you just mentioned, the soldiers being able to go into a home and take that, and occupy it for their needs, that's in our Bill of Rights because of what was happening in our country before we were the United States and when the British were here. Yeah. But that's probably one of those rights that you forget about because it's a little more, or it's obscure. And it's not like freedom of speech, which you use every day. It's not something that you and I or previous generations have dealt with.
Not for quite a while.
And which brings me to some of these others that I want to bring up in the First Amendment. In this survey, only 27% of the people surveyed could name the right to assemble.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's one of those that's forgotten, and it shouldn't be in light of what happened with the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we had been more aware of our right to assemble and our freedom of religion, you put those two together, would we have acquiesced so easily to letting our churches be shut down?
Yeah. But I do think that having that happen brought that awareness to a lot of people. Maybe not everybody, but I think a lot of people started thinking a lot deeper about, wait a minute, can they tell us we can't get together whenever we want? And I think a lot of people started thinking more about that right. After COVID.
I think that's a good point. And if that's what it took, then that's the silver lining in that whole experience.
Yeah, I'm looking for one.
Somewhere. That was not a good experience.
Yeah.
Here's another one. This is interesting. About 1 in 10, they say 11% can recognize or recall the right to petition the government.
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you right now that until I read this, I had forgotten about that. I probably could have named freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press.
Yeah.
I would not have recalled that one, I don't think. Yeah.
But it's a hugely important one because that was, at the time, they were restricted. And even now, sometimes it's very hard to petition your government. It's very complicated, and nobody really knows how do you even do that. We can call our congressman, supposedly. Our congressman's door is open. We can call them up or write them a letter and stop by their office and talk to somebody, supposedly. So people don't really know what the best way to do that is.
They don't, and I think that creates that animosity towards the lobbyists, which this is going to be another show that we're going to talk about at some point later on. But this idea that all lobbyists are bad, and because you feel like you've lost your voice, and it's only the lobbyists that get their will
That's
in
a
Congress.
good point. They have the voice, whereas the First Amendment says we all have the voice, and we feel like we don't now, and so we're resentful of those that do.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, yeah.
Let's talk about freedom of speech. 74% could answer that was one of the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment. And that was the strongest one, by the way. That's, like you're saying,
that's the main one.
That's in our spirit as Americans. I don't know when that gets pushed into our psyche, maybe in grade school or something
Somewhere,
like that.
yeah.
But we know it. We exercise it every day.
Yeah.
There's certainly, I think, some bully pulpits out there now, some people that are trying to push that away. The sort of cancel culture that's happening is trying to erode that. But there's a lot of pushback that I'm seeing.
Yeah,
now.
there is. People that normally wouldn't think would be out there pushing for rights are saying, wait a minute, you can't tell me to shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, as I mentioned earlier, 39% can recognize freedom of religion. That
Seems
really
awful
low.
low. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how accurate that is, and that goes back to that small sample size.
Yeah. And I assume it's spread across the whole country. Maybe a lot of people don't care about that. And honestly, the sample size does bother me because I was scaling it down a little bit, and basically it says 5 people are doing a survey for 1 million people.
Right.
And I thought, how can 5 people represent the opinion of 1 million people very accurately?
Right.
So I do have an issue with the sample size, but I know that surveying is pretty sophisticated, and supposedly they have algorithms that fix all that kind of stuff.
I don't know if I trust that either.
I don't know.
Now, let's touch on freedom of the press. According to the survey, 29% of respondents recognize that right. That's even lower than the religion. I think that should almost be reversed.
That could also be a sort of respect thing. In today's society, people are very mad at different parts of the press,
Right.
one part or another part. And I don't think there's very many people that are saying, yeah, let them all talk, and I love them all. So that answer could be more coming from people's personal opinions of the press.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is that this survey was done in May of last year, leading up to a presidential election. And I really would have liked to have seen that survey done in May and then done again in October and then done again in December.
That would be
right?
interesting, yes.
Wouldn't it? Because I think that people get more, as an election year goes on, people get a lot more emotional and fixated on their positions.
Yeah. And that would be interesting, especially in light of the second part of the survey about the Supreme Court and people's opinions of that.
Oh,
How that would have changed over time, because I think the time-changing opinions played a big part in that part of the surveys. Let's take a quick break here. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, and come back and we're going to talk about the Supreme Court and maybe some other things that we're going to do down the line. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. You were just about to talk about the Supreme Court section of the survey.
Yeah, in this survey, they asked the respondents to get some information about what their understanding of the Supreme Court and other issues that are relevant today or people are talking about. So one of the questions was, in a 5-4 Supreme Court ruling, what happens after that decision? And almost 75%, I think it was 73%, correctly said the decision is it's the law and it needs to be followed. And that's correct. But other respondents were split, some saying that it needs to go back to Congress for reconsideration, and that was 13%. Right?
Yeah, that's that far end.
Yeah, and then another 13% said that it goes back to a federal court of appeals to be decided.
I thought that one was weird. Why would the Supreme Court push something down to overturn what they decided?
Right.
But I think that might come from, I'm trying to reach for some excuses for some of these people, I think, but it occurred to me that a lot of times the Supreme Court will not decide a case and they'll kick it back to a lower court and say,
right.
Hey, you guys need to look at this under this new light or in a different way or something like that. And so maybe those people were thinking along those lines, but I think I'm stretching to find an excuse for that opinion.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were saying about that 20% that, you'll always have that far out answer.
Yeah.
But in their defense, we don't really hear about the Supreme Court. A lot of their decisions, I'll cite, for example, last year, the Chevron decision. Mm-hmm. In the business world, that might mean something to you. In the legal world, that might mean something to you, or the political world. But to average Joe citizen, it doesn't mean anything. Now, the Dobbs decision, that got a lot of press, right? But when they are in session, they are coming up with all kinds of things, not just Dobbs, right? They're tackling all kinds of weighty issues. And you'll never see them on TV, right? Mm-hmm. Every Republican congressman tries to get on Fox News, and every Democrat congressman is trying to get on MSNBC, right? And you see them. You hear the senators. You see them on TV. You hear them on the radio. You never see the Supreme Court justices doing any of that stuff. And so I think I can believe that people would have a smaller idea of what and how the Supreme Court operates.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. They're definitely a behind-the-scenes kind of operation because they don't make law. They just say, okay, this works, this doesn't work. And a lot of, like you said, they do a lot of other stuff where they're just deciding some particular case about who is actually right. It just happened to end up on their desk. We only see, I don't even know, 2% of the stuff that they do actually makes it into the national news. Dobbs was several years ago, and that's probably the only recent case that most people could think of. So every few years, some case that they decide comes out, and they see hundreds in a year.
I think you and I, we have a mutual friend, probably the only friend that you and I have that actually reads every decision that comes out from the court, and like he knows where to go to read that. He's a bit of a political junkie, but I don't know anybody else that's waiting when they're in session is just sitting there with just, oh my gosh, salivating, waiting for the next decision to get handed down. So here's some more numbers for you. This came from the survey. Americans overwhelmingly know that Supreme Court justices are appointed, 86% to not elected, 13%. There's a little more knowledge there about how they get there. On the question of life terms or fixed terms, Americans broadly know that Supreme Court justices serve a life term, 85%, whereas 15% believe that it was a set number of years.
Yeah, I don't know where they would have gotten that.
but I don't either.
Whatever.
Then who decides if the president's actions are constitutional? Now, this number's a little low. It's over half Americans, but 56% knew that the Supreme Court had final responsibility in that area. 23% thought that Congress had the final say.
Yeah. And maybe they're mixing up who makes the laws that the president is supposed to follow as to what he's doing is right. So maybe they're mixing some stuff up. I don't know. Yeah. When you compare that and you look back at the section where it talks about who can name the three branches of government, if they can't name the three branches of government, then they're really not going to know much about how they relate.
Yeah. That goes back to that small sample size again. And how accurate is that?
One or two people can turn it quite a bit.
Yeah. So also in the survey, there was a section where they asked about Supreme Court reforms. Yeah, those were interesting.
Yeah, and that's interesting in a survey that's supposed to be about the Constitution. So
Yeah, I don't know how far I
Why?
should dive into that, but the questions, I'll share a few with the audience here. They talked about a formal ethics code, prohibiting participation of justices with conflicts, a mandatory retirement age, term limits, increasing the size of the court. I thought in light of this coming out in an election year where those topics were brought up, that I began to wonder about if there was a lean to the survey. And I'd hate to think that, but
Honestly, I think anybody that spends money on a survey wants a particular answer. So I'd like to think that any given survey is completely unbiased, but I don't.
yeah.
But what I did find interesting is they did talk in the survey, they did talk about how it's changed over time from the last time they did the survey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, for me, the bigger story there is the impact that our media has on people's opinions. Because before, in the years prior, people weren't so much in favor of some of these various reforms, but now they're a lot more in favor of a lot of these reforms. And I think that's driven a lot by the vilification of the Supreme Court and a lot of the media that comes out and has started attacking them.
And you know what's interesting is that in this survey, they found broad support, actually, for most of these reforms. And there's not a huge difference between Democrats and Republicans, 87% for Democrats, 83% for Republicans. But one of the things that caught my eye, and I think this is really the reason behind our show, so I want to bring this up. In their analysis, they found that people with the lowest level of civics knowledge were less likely to support a measure prohibiting justices from taking part in cases in which they have a conflict. And that's, wow, it would seem to me natural for anybody to say, yeah, you've got a conflict of interest. You shouldn't rule on that. You shouldn't sit at the dais for that question. But the less you know about civics, the more likely you are to go along with a conflict of interest, according to this analysis.
Yes.
And I thought that's interesting. And it was also found that people with a lower knowledge of civics would be more likely to support a measure allowing the public to vote on overturning a controversial ruling, right? And that almost, to me, speaks to the current trend of populism that we see going on in both parties.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other. It's both of them.
Yeah.
And that's a lack of understanding of a Republican form of government. You'd say, okay, I didn't like the result that came from this recent Supreme Court ruling, so we're going to take it to the voters.
And somehow that will make it constitutional.
Right, right.
Which is absurd because the Constitution is something set down already that is a set of rules that you've got to follow.
Right.
All these reforms, whenever I looked at each one of them, I was like, okay, who decides that? So who's going to rule over the Supreme Court? So if somebody has, right now in the Supreme Court, if a justice decides that they have a conflict of interest, they'll recuse themselves. And that happens occasionally, not that much. But there's two thoughts I have for this. One is these people were appointed because, theoretically, they can make decisions regardless of their personal interest. We all can do that. Mm. We all have interests that we pursue, but we also make decisions contrary to those direct interests when we say, oh, but that's not right, so I'm not going to shoplift in the store because it's not right to steal, even though I really want that gadget over there. So we always do that. And these are people that supposedly we believe have a strong sense of ruling for what's right rather than their own interests. So there's that. But also, who decides what a conflict of interest is? Every case you can look at and say, you do have an interest in that in airplanes, so I don't think you should decide on that Boeing case because you know what? When you were a kid, you used to build model airplanes, and your favorite was actually the 747, so you should recuse yourself. So who decides that? And the concept of a Supreme Court is that nobody can control them. So I have a problem with a lot of the reforms. I think you can ask the Supreme Court to give more voice to that, or maybe ask for more transparency on some of those things. But I would be hesitant to give an outside body control over any of those decisions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the uproar that we saw last year about conflicts and with the court, and we want a stricter form of ethics and all that, those questions were coming from one side.
Right. They were all in response to Dobbs.
Right.
They were targeting certain justices.
Yeah. And I think if the court swung in a different direction, we probably would not have seen those questions.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah. Pretty interesting survey. I try not to get too depressed by these surveys. And as you can tell, I try and find reasons for why somebody would answer a certain way.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not sure I did a very good job of it. But I try and believe that a lot of these values are deep into our culture.
Yeah.
You know.
Agreed.
So I want to bring up a book that is online with this. It's called Behind the Bill of Rights, written by Bill Norton and Jeremy Nelson. It's actually published by the National Center for Constitutional Studies, and it is actually a fascinating book because it has sections on the history of rights going back to the Normans and whatnot, and how in England they developed these concepts of rights and separation of powers. And then it talks about specific principles, and then it has a chapter on every amendment, where it comes from, what it means, and some of the cases that were used in that case, and the arguments in both directions. So it's a fascinating book. We have it at the Boerne Bookshop, and it's really cool. And I think this might be a great book that will kick off our upcoming discussions
on each amendment. And when we get to amendment number 2, we could probably just turn the mic over to Lexi and just walk out. What do you think?
I will be a guest on that show. How about that?
That works.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're going to go over the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And go through each right and discuss it. And that should be fascinating. Hopefully we'll develop some interest in that.
All right.
So that's it for today. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop. Thank you for joining us. And if you missed anything, you can always go to BoerneRadio.com and listen to our podcast there. So thank you for joining us. See you next week.